The history of Felton, I'm going to start with, is very interesting because none of you would probably guess what the first thing people thought of when they thought Felton. It's gold. This is a gold town, guys. It's a mining town. Yes, there was lumber harvesting here. Rancho Zayani with Isaac Graham. You've all heard of him. That was happening here, but it wasn't exactly profitable. It certainly wasn't the number one draw. Felton didn't exist, really, until they discovered gold on Gold Gulch, which is about a mile to the south of here. Now, I'm not talking about Gold Gulch in this presentation, but it is important to understand that it was the aftermath of the people. Basically, people realized, hey, there's gold here. Everybody moved here, and then they realized there's really not that much gold here. In fact, it's not even clear if the gold's from here. It could be from the Sierra Nevadas, and, you know, Ice Age and everything. Stuff rolled down creeks, and it ended up here. So we're not really sure where that gold came from, or if it's still there. There were tons of mining things, but the end result is there's a ton of people now living here, and they're without jobs. So what do you do when you need jobs, but you don't want to move away? You find other things to do. And so that's where we get the other two products. We have limestone and lumber. Now limestone, again, you guys are really close to a lime kiln, or a group of lime kilns actually, right up at the end of Keene Street, which is 1 block over, and 2 blocks that way. There are still lime kilns in people's backyards. And you probably know Fall Creek has lime kilns also, and there's a bunch up at UCSC. That's what brought people, or that's what kept people here. They started working in the lime industry, and things kept going. Lots of people, Henry Cowell and Isaac Davis started buying up a ton of land to keep building these lime kilns. And one thing kilns really, really need is lumber. And you got plenty of lumber here. You got old growth redwood trees everywhere. And remember, we're talking about 1850s, 1860s. This entire valley, for the most part, was old growth lumber. Yes, you had some chaparral. Parts of Felton probably were an actual meadow, although it's hard to tell now where the real meadow is and where things have been dynamited and now it's just a unnatural meadow. But, yeah, so lime and lumber are really what kept people here. And this is a picture of, this is San Lorenzo Gorge, probably around Inspiration Point or so. This could even be Inspiration Point, down Highway 9. And you can see, it's steep, it's rugged. There weren't very many trees because by this point they probably had already been harvested, but there's no railroad. And this is what the valley still looked like around 1870. So we've got a huge problem here. In 1861 or so, there's still no way out of the valley. The only road that would get us out of this valley from where we are right now is Graham Hill Road, which was called Graham's Grade. It has a 10% grade still today. Imagine hauling big loads of lumber up that with oxen, horse, and donkeys. That's what you would have had to do. And so people started thinking, what am I going to do next? Well, they built a toll road. So in 1868, they built a toll road, and that's what I just showed you in the previous picture. They built a toll road to Santa Cruz. And it was rugged, it was tough, it was on these high cliffs, but it worked. It got people there, but it was a toll road for a number of years. People had to pay for it. And the only other option was if you're in Boulder Creek, you could go the other way. In 1871, there was the Saratoga Toll Road, the McClay Turnpike. You can still actually see this a little bit if you go way up there. It's basically part of Castle Rock State Park in and out now. It's not completely, but you can actually go up there. You can walk there. Just for future reference, you can actually see parts of the old railroad up there. And so that is something I recommend. But 1871, it's a decade later than I'm talking about. And there's almost no roads within the valley. There's kind of Highway 9, but it's really muddy in the winter. You can't really cross it. There's a couple crisscross roads throughout, but there's really not a whole lot going on in the valley. Like, you just cannot get anywhere. So the first option people turn to, and this is Rancho Zayani in 1864. And so you can really see 1864, this is pretty much where you are at right now, more or less. This is probably looking up either San Lorenzo Valley or Zayante Creek. And it's just really rugged. It's a ranch. There's been a lot of logging, but it's really rugged. So the first thing people thought of in 1861, let's build a railroad. And so it sounds like a cool idea. It would have been one of the first, if it had gotten done in 1861, it would have been the second or third operating commercial railroad in California. But a lot of delays happened. It takes a lot of money. It was going to be a 16-mile railroad. It would have gone all the way up to Boulder Creek, or at the time it was called Lorenzo, maybe Boulder by this point, but the town itself wasn't really formed. It was still forming. Think of Boulder Creek at this time as a logging community more than anything. And so they proposed, let's take a train all the way up there and we'll build this route. And then maybe someday we can get to Saratoga or Mountain View. That is going to be a recurring theme in both of my talks. They're always thinking, let's just keep going. If you've gone up to the top of that thing, you gotta go over Saratoga Gap. It's not just an easy, we're just gonna build a train over that. You'd have to tunnel through it, and it never happened. So it took them 7 years before they actually started working on the San Lorenzo Valley Railroad. And within a few months, Isaac Davis and Henry Cattle sued them. Because there's something that what you could do back in 1868 that you can't do today. And it is condemn land without paying for it. And so the railroad was like, hey, we're just going to build through pretty much where Henry Cattle Park is right now along the San Lorenzo River. We're going to build this. So they start grading from Felton towards Santa Cruz. And there's remnants of this grade still close to the river level. And after they started working in Henry Cow's land, they were cutting down their trees. Henry Cow's not profiting from these trees, and he really wanted money. So he sued them. They got a stop order. They couldn't work on a train anymore. And after 6 years, the landmark Supreme Court case said you cannot take condemned land without compensation for a railroad. And that was it. By then, they've already wasted all their money on building on legal fees and everything. It was done. But 1874 ended up being an important date. And this is just one of the very few remnants we have of the San Lorenzo Railroad. The county records also has their incorporation papers, but there's really not a whole lot. So 1874, San Lorenzo Valley Railroad is done, and we're working on an entirely new idea. Okay, if a railroad's not going to work, let's do a flume. And a flume, in this case, it's what they're proposing is a V-flume. Lisa has given numerous talks on this over the years. It's a V-flume. It's literally a V. It has water going down it, and you send finished lumber down there. It will be standard board feet of lumber, which is a foot by an inch, and they'll send logs down all the way to their end point. And the proposed end point was originally Santa Cruz. Now again, they ran into problems. They wanted to do a 16-mile flume from basically the headwaters of Boulder Creek all the way down to Santa Cruz. How many of you guys are from the San Lorenzo Valley? How many sources of water, like creeks and whatnot, are there south of Felton? Very few. There's Eagle Creek. Depending where you start, you got Fall Creek and Zayene, but there's really nothing. And that was the big problem. They're like, okay, we're going to have this go all the way to Santa Cruz. The flume would have dried out before any of that lumber made it to Santa Cruz. And that was a huge problem because flumes are leaky things. I mean, they have to be constantly fed. And there was feeder creeks at almost every major creek between Boulder Creek and Felton. But they could not actually get it past Santa Cruz. And from the start, they knew this was going to be a problem. So they never actually built anything south of Felton. But what they did build is a railroad. And the railroad is going to be an important a piece of this puzzle. And you notice I still haven't actually talked about the Boulder Creek branch because it's going to be a little while before we get to that. So construction on the Flume began in 1875, and that's also when the railroad construction for the Santa Cruz to Felton line began. Both basically opened October 13th, 1875, and then just for future reference, it was leased to the South Pacific Coast Railroad in 1879. So I'm going to show you a couple pictures. We're going to start at the Boulder Creek end of things and go south. So this was the Flume Mill. So it's about 2 miles north of Boulder Creek. They actually would build the chunks of V-flume, and they'd send it down the creek, or down the flume, and then when it reached the end, they'd assemble it on the site, and then just keep doing that until they had the whole thing built. Whether this structure itself became the Cunningham Mill, or whether this was burned down or demolished and a new mill was built, it's not clear, but this site did later become another lumber mill that we'll talk about a little bit.
So where is that actually
This is 2 miles up San Lorenzo Valley San Lorenzo River past Boulder Creek. So today it would be the Wildwood community. Yeah, so I think there's still a sign there, at least a Wildwood Road. So this would be in the Wildwood area. All right, and then just a little bit south of there, you have the Harmon family. They're sitting out inside their house here, and you can see the Flume running in the back lot there. And this is a picture anyone who's seen this loves it because there's so many little details. You have a pile of firewood or split stuff sitting on the side here. This is the Flume. If there's any logs on it, the motion blur has made it so you can't see them, but it looks like it's just water at this point. There is a guy up there that is a Flume walker, and his job is to make sure that the lumber doesn't get jammed. So he's going to keep poking it with sticks until it unjams, because a log jam would be a very bad thing to happen. Then you also have this hunter over here who's got his kill on the log next to him. So you can see people like posing with these photos. Most of these photos are from 1875. A couple of them could have slightly wrong dates, but in 75, right after the Flume opened, a photographer came and just took photos of the entire route. And then this is a fun pastime people used to have. This was flume riding. There's a woman, you can barely see her, but there's a woman on a actual little raft, and she is going down the Flume. And there's a man walking next to her, and then there's also a man with a dog down below. So it was good transportation to get down to Felton or Ben Lomond or anywhere you wanted to go. All right, and then these are the really impressive things. So, in fact, one of these is painted on the side of a building in Boulder Creek. The Flume had to stay at an even grade. The entire time is going, I've got it written down, 1 second. Yeah, where is it? 5 inches for every 80 feet. So it had to go down 5 inches for every 80 feet. And that means it had to be pretty much level, because if there's a single spot that dips, it will start overflowing there will be a log jam, and it will no longer go downhill. And so you keep going down the Flume, and you have these beautiful trestles that have to go over the creeks and the rivers, because otherwise it's not going to keep going down. And these things were massive. One of these has a person next to it, actually. Yeah, one of these has a person next to it. Yeah, so this one's taken from a person's normal height looking up. So just gives you an impression. They could be up to 200 feet high. Wow. And unfortunately, there's no real remnants of any of these left. In all my hikes, everything, I've never seen a foundation or anything that seems to be from one of these. So this, as it's coming probably near Felton, because Felton had started getting a little bit more level again, you get these gentle curves around it. That's another Flume walker who's just sitting on the Flume waiting for some lumber to come down. And we'll get to the very end of this in a little bit. So the other end of this equation was getting it from Felton to Santa Cruz. And they built this line in tandem, different crews obviously, but in tandem with the Flume line. And so it was intended to link Felton and Santa Cruz. It had a very short-term goal. Unlike many of the operations in the area, which were really just, we want to do crazy things, this one had a very short-term goal. They just wanted to connect the 2 points. They started building it in spring 1875. They built a wharf at the beach, and this thing has been kind of confused over the years, but they built a wharf in 1875 that linked up to an older wharf that was owned by the California Powder Works that was right next door at the end of Main Street. This wharf is basically where the current wharf is, but was just a teeny bit over, because they actually coexisted for a little while. And just like the Flume itself, this was leased to South Pacific Coast Railroad in 1879, and it was actually merged into the South Pacific Coast Railway, which was then sold to Southern Pacific in 1887. So this one ended up being a vital piece to the mountain route when that eventually opened. And that opened in 1880. All right, and then this is a map showing, it's not 100% accurate because I took this from my book, which covers different things, but the original route went from this wharf here, not this one, this is the municipal wharf, went from this wharf here all the way up there, and it followed the left bank to Old Felton. And you guys are all in Old Felton right now. Not that new Felton across the creek with the Safeway. You're in Old Felton, the classic one. The original railroad only built one tunnel. That was this one here. This was actually the second tunnel that South Pacific Coast, or Southern Pacific, ended up having to demolish when they standard gauged the line. So this one doesn't exist anymore. They then built, this is the one that they built first. This is the one that's still today in Santa Cruz. This was built in 1876. because the original route went through downtown, down Pacific Avenue, and surprise, people didn't want big freight trains going down Pacific Avenue. So they decided going through the hill would be better and probably cheaper in the long run. And this tunnel up here wasn't built until 1879 by the South Pacific Coast right after they acquired the line. It was the sharpest turn on the railroad, and every one of you can experience that if you go on the Big Trees train to Santa Cruz, because that tunnel burned down in the 90s, and now you have to go back on the original alignment, which is a very sharp turn right before the nice concrete arch that you can see from that.
When was Tunnel 7 destroyed?
Tunnel 7 was destroyed, I want to say around 1900, a little bit after. It's when they were standard gauging it. It kept getting wider, and they just couldn't handle it anymore.
Wasn't there any evidence of that?
No, now it's just a cut. No, it's just a cut there now. So, I mean, you won't see. You go through there. If you walked in that section, it's just a deep cut in the ground right before the railroad crosses Highway 9. All right, and so there were a number of stops. Some of these stops are a couple years later, but these were all during the narrow gauge times. They have the California Powder Works, which is Paradise Park today. They produced black powder from, I want to say they're incorporated in 63, but let's see, yeah, 63. And they kept operating until 1914. Downtown, well, actually, we'll get to that one in a second. Yeah, we'll just go on. So, so Summit here was eventually made for Henry Cowell. Remember, Henry Cowell was the one that kind of ruined the San Lorenzo Railroad? The Summit station was their little, like, we're going to give you a stop, and you can do whatever you want with that stop if you let us build through your land. So that was some of the compensation. And that Summit eventually became called Rincon. It's a fire road. You can still go there today. Lots of bicyclists are parked there on weekends in the summer. And the Summit, or the Rincon stop, was actually a lime kiln in later years. All right, so moving down. So this is the St. Charles Hotel right here. The railroad tracks would be going right between these two buildings, actually. It became a streetcar line after that tunnel was made. And the Santa Cruz and Felton was a freight railroad. You have to remember that. They only had 2 passenger cars that they bought, and I believe they're both 1876. They were a freight railroad. Those passenger cars were mostly because people kept riding the trains. They'd get on flat cars and want to ride the trains. And so they figured, okay, fine, we'll buy some passenger cars and that will satisfy demand. And so the St. Charles Hotel ended up being the ticket office. They didn't have a formal ticket office. You would go to St. Charles Hotel, say, I want to ride up to Felton. You'd buy your ticket there. And so that was, for the entire time that the Santa Cruz and Felton was an independent operation, that happened. And then in 1880 or so, the South Pacific Coast built a really nice station downtown, a couple blocks away. And so that, yeah.
What's that building?
That's a high school, I believe. Up in
the
on the hill? Yeah, I believe that's the high school, or just the school.
That was first the elementary school, then they had a high school, and all across.
Yeah.
That's why the other school is now called Mission Hill, even though it's not truly on Mission Hill because it used to be there.
Okay, well there you go. Lots of fun history you find just doing railroad research. In fact, this is what I live for, is these kind of things. So as we move up the valley, this is the California Powder Works here, and you can see the railroad tracks. It's a nice stereograph. In the 70s, stereographs are super popular, so there's a number of stereograph photos you'll see. This is a little bit, it's very sepia at this point, but you can see over here, that's the Powder Works in the distance, and the San Lorenzo River. So as you go up, they did run into a lot of engineering problems. So this here is roughly the area around Inspiration Point and just south of it. And there were a number of these really kind of cheaply made trestles. This will surprise some of you, but there is actually a full truss bridge under here, like the one that's over, or that Bay Street goes over the railroad tracks in Santa Cruz. There's a full one of those hidden in that little cleft right there. So it didn't, I mean, it held up well enough, but South Pacific Coast didn't like it, so they replaced it with their own bridge later. And this is the train, a close-up of the train actually parked on top of it. And that's their passenger car. I believe this is their nice, classy one. You can tell the difference because the second-class passenger car had no windows. So they were trying to save some money. So this is probably their first-class one because it looks like it has windows and some of them look like they're up. And this is the back, probably the same exact train ride. This is the back going through a really tight squeeze there. One of the squeezes was so tight that it kept knocking off the back step of the passenger car. All right, and so we finally met at Felton, and this is where we are today, more or less. This is across the street. Literally, just across the street. This is where Felton Depot was. They had the Flume transfer yard there. This is, from what I've been told, this roof here is probably the roof of the station. We have no actual picture of the station, but it's been said that that's probably the roof. This was probably taken in 1876, and it's a celebration of some sort. And yeah, Felton, this is what the passenger car, Felton clearly had, people liked coming here. Yeah.
I heard that some of these early engines like that migrated down to South America. Do you know any history about that?
Ask me again at the end of the talk, and I may be able to answer that with some of them. And then I also told you about the Holmes Lime Works. So this is pretty much the field, just on Heen Road, kind of near the post office, looking up Heen Road here. In fact, this is the driveway now. This was a little minecart incline. And this is what it looks like when you're inside. So that's outside, this is inside. You can see a boxcar sitting back here. Piles of bricks ready for shipment. You got the kilns up in the hills there. This is a little bit later, but this was operating from the 1890s, I believe. Let me check 1 second. Of course, I don't have the actual date for that. Yeah, I think it was 1890s, maybe even earlier. Yeah.
Where would Railroad Avenue be in relationship?
In Boulder Creek? Or
No. Isn't
there's not Railroad Avenue in Felton that I know of.
just before the bridge
Where?
on Graham Hill?
Well, this is on this side of town. This is just on Hume Street, just down there. It's just this is just 2 blocks down the road. So, yeah, and then
Didn't they have a spur line that went up to
the quarry line, they didn't have a railroad line that went up the quarry. They had a minecart line that went up there. All right, guys. And then this is the big thing that I wanted to show you. This is a nice stereoscope or stereograph of the interchange. Again, this is directly across the street. This is pretty much where New Leaf is today. So you have the Flume coming down from Boulder Creek. This is just about the end of it right here. You can see the lumber is being piled off the sides. This is a rare photo because you also have both engines. They had 2 engines originally. They had one that was very interestingly called the Santa Cruz, and the other one that was called the Felton, because that was creativity back in 1875.
Is this looking north or south?
This is looking north.
Looking
And so
north.
you're looking from the very end of the Flume and pretty much the beginning of the railroad.
Right
And so,
between the Flume and the river. Okay.
I can't tell you exactly where New Leaf was, but it's probably just slightly to the left of this.
You pointed out the Craven House.
Oh, that's true. That's this one here, right?
Oh, yeah.
So actually, yeah, we're a little bit further south from
Yeah,
that.
that's the
Good
church.
call. Yeah, the station was where that was. Yeah, so we're a little bit close. We're probably closer to like the Presbyterian Church, the Chinese restaurant kind of area.
And the river's down on the right.
The river's down to the right. All right, and then just to show you real clearly where we are, we're at Kirby Street, right here. So that's us. And this map, it's a little fanciful. This was subdivided. It was not sold this way. But this is what the city was actually planned to look like in 1889. And so this whole thing here is the depot transfer yard. And by this point, the Flume had gone, but the yard was still there. And you can see, this is a big section here, and we're right across the street. So the depot would literally be right here. And that looks like Elm Street. There's no Elm Street there today, so
wait,
you can't really tell.
What's now Highway 9 was Bennett Street, wasn't it?
Highway 9 was Baldwin Avenue.
It's Baldwin Avenue.
Baldwin
So
Avenue.
that was Bennett Street. Okay, never mind.
So Bennett Street is Empire Grade, or Felton Empire, sorry. And okay, so the big problem ended up being, unsurprisingly, people really liked coming to Felton. The Flume, or the lumber companies really liked using the Flume. The Flume has a maximum capacity. It can only have so much lumber. Plus, it can't operate in the late summer and in the fall because there's no water. And that's seriously, the lumber companies in good years, they could run almost all year long. I've read that some lumber companies started as early as February, and they'd run all the way through early December. So pretty much, it's only when the rain started that they really had to shut down. The problem was you need the rain to get the water. And so you get this, and they did have a number of dams, and they had a number of feeder creeks that helped it, but it just didn't work at capacity, plus every storm that came by knocked it out. Everything, pretty much anything that could go wrong with the Flume did go wrong. There was a snow one year, and it just destroyed huge parts of it. So you've got this really cool idea that's just not meeting capacity. Plus, the roads are getting improved. There's a railroad now. Everybody's starting to move into the valley. They're starting to harvest lumber. How are you getting it to town? Well, people are starting to use oxen and donkeys and horses again because they can't use the Flume. They go over the hill. If they're in Boulder Creek, they start going over the hill to Saratoga because it's easier to take the Saratoga toll road after 1871. And so it's starting to fall apart. It's in need of repair. This is an interesting one. In November 1876, the Santa Cruz and Felton made a subsidiary called the Felton and San Lorenzo Railroad Company. And it was this grand idea. We're going to get a train going all the way up to Valley, eventually over to Saratoga. I said this was going to be a recurring theme. It did nothing because everybody who had already invested in the railroad, they already had invested. They didn't want to give more money to just get it going again. They were happy with their low efficiency at the time or their other options. So it didn't happen. The railroad, it's mentioned a couple times in the newspaper and then disappears. So the next step then was we need to replace the Flume. And you are going to replace it with a railroad. But just the section. They're not doing the whole thing. And again, Felton and San Lorenzo Railroad failed because it had no funders. But the South Pacific Coast Railroad took it over in 1879, and they have lots of money. One of their main financiers is the guy who made a fortune off the Comstock lode. He's got tons of money. So he can make this railroad. So when he bought he bought everything in 1879, the South Pacific Coast Railroad, it's a San Francisco company. They were already making a route that went, actually by 1880, they already had a route that went all the way to Santa Cruz because they had bought out the Felton and Santa Cruz Railroad. They also bought out the Flume. So it was their job to fix this. So this right here is Old Felton. Felton Junction, they have it on here. This is Old Felton. That is where the modern station is. If you go on Graham Hill Road, you can still see it's not the one that was built at this time, but you can still see the Southern Pacific Station off Graham Hill Road right in front of Roaring Camp. What you don't know is that little driveway, when you're going from here to Santa Cruz on Graham Hill Road, is a driveway that people often take as a shortcut to get into the lumberyard. That is the Felton and Pescadero Railroad's right-of-way. And that was there, and spoiler, that was there until 1934. And so they've just maintained it since then because by that point, Santa Cruz Lumber had already bought out the property. They liked having it. It was easy. The trucks didn't have to go down that steep hill to get down there. And so you have the Boulder Creek branch here. You still have the old Felton Depot there, though. And the real question is, why did they go across the river when they already had stuff on this side of the river? You can blame people in Felton for that. People in Felton, they are like, ooh, they want to buy stuff. We're going to charge them a lot for it. So it was like, yeah, we'll give you our land, but we're going to charge you a fortune for it. People were living on the land, on the right-of-way. And the railroad was just like, we don't need to do this. We're going to just move to some place where people aren't already living and get cheap land. That's exactly what they did. So they went to the other side of the river, and Old Felton kind of started, that's what got named Old Felton, because this was New Felton. Old Felton just kind of started deteriorating as a railroad town at this point. It had no link. It was the end of a line that was already defunct. The spot where that line broke off is, if you ever walk down the Garden of Eden and you cross the railroad tracks on the path there, that's the old railroad line that used to go to Old Felton. But now you know it goes over to Big Trees, and then it goes over to Felton. Big Trees, Henry Cal. It goes over to Felton, and then it goes, well, where does it go? It goes through Safeway, or more or less through Safeway, the parking lot Safeway. And that's where this goes. This goes right, like Safeway would be, it's about here. It goes right through Safeway. It follows the other side of the river for a long time. So, okay.
Go back 1 second.
Yeah.
Graham Hill Road now is
Graham Hill Road is this road here.
down here.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if there's actually, yeah. This should, it's been edited.
Safeway's up over there.
Yeah, Safeway's
Mount
up over
Herman
here.
Road, which doesn't exist, is sort of going up at an angle that way.
All right, Mount Herman Road. It was going to be years before that
I
popped
don't
up.
know, but it would be going up at an angle.
Yeah, it would be coming from
Down in
here,
there.
roughly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where was Welsh Farm?
No, it's on the other side of the river, though.
Welsh Farm. This is the Welsh Farm down here.
No,
Like-
up there.
Oh, yeah. This is sorry. Yeah, that's the Big Tree. That's Henry Cowell's meadow.
And Big Trees is where?
Big Cruz would be just to the left, off the screen. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
this thing,
south is to the left.
yeah, this should be,
Okay.
yes, there you go. South is to the left.
South is to the left. Got it.
Sorry about that. I should have just clarified that from the beginning. So the Flume. The Flume's still here, guys. We've got a railroad starting, but the Flume's here. So we have the Felton and Pescadero Railroad. Felton and Pescadero Railroad. Well, that sounds ambitious. We're in Felton and we're going to get to Pescadero. Once again, they had grand visions for all the railroads they ever founded. They're planning to go to Pescadero. Forget Saratoga. This time we're trying to go back to the coast through a loop track. And so we're thinking, okay, we're going to get up to Pescadero. Again, it never happened. But the plan was to do that, but their immediate concern was to get up the San Lorenzo River to Boulder Creek, or what was called then as Lorenzo. The first priority, so grading began in spring 1884. The route was completed within just about a year, so it really went fast. And this company was also merged and acquired by the South Pacific Coast Railway, which then was bought by the Southern Pacific Railroad.
Where was your proposed route north of Boulder Creek?
Where was it?
No, the proposed route Pescadero, north of Boulder Creek. Where are they planning to link up with?
I will show you that in a couple slides, actually. I get back to that one because it's a very interesting thing, although that will be a little bit more of a topic for the second talk. I can definitely give some of that. And so the Boulder Creek branch, what ended up being formed, so we got Felton here. This is New Felton across the river where the station currently is. And you have all these stops. This branch wasn't quite built yet. That was built around 1903. And then you keep going up. Pacific Mills was the site of Ben Lomond. I've got a picture of that in a second. But you notice there's a lot of them, and all of these, that's a lumber spur. Boulder Mill is obviously a lumber thing. It's called a mill. Pacific Mills, lumber. Newell Creek was a shingle mill. We're not 100% positive what Root Bottom and Pettus were, but again, they seem to probably have been lumber things. And Kent Spur was also lumber. This is a lumber railroad. It was designed, because it was South Pacific Coast, they always designed it to be passenger friendly. Most of their trains, maybe not most, but a lot of their trains were mixed. That means you get a couple passenger cars and a ton of freight cars. But they always had freight on the mind. And this line would never have existed if there weren't something to make it financially viable, and that was the lumber. And the same thing can be said for Santa Cruz and Felton when that was first formed. They had no intention whatsoever to do passengers. This line, they did plan to do passengers, but still, you have to remember, they're not building this for passengers. Passengers do not bring revenue to these lines in most cases, at least not enough to make them viable. These are expensive steam engines that are running them, and they've got lots and lots of crew that have to maintain them.
Is that basically Highway 9 now?
No, actually, Highway 9, for most of this route, Highway 9 is actually on the west side of the river. The railroad track was almost always on the east side.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I should also note that a lot of this right-of-way does survive in segments, especially up till Glen Arbor. And in Glen Arbor, roads and subdivisions have basically built over them. But there are lots of sections where there's a road that is actually the old right-of-way, or that often the fire roads, Santa Cruz Water District has bought out a lot of the roads, or a lot of the right-of-way for its stuff. But all the bridge foundations, the later ones, the standard gauge ones, all of them survive in some form or another. Be it piers, concrete piers, be it little posts that are left that were sawed off, but you can still see them above the creek. So this line still exists in a way, but unlike the one that went over the mountains, a lot of sections of this got subdivided into parcels, and you can't actually access them anymore. So that's something you always want to remember with the Boulder Creek branch. It was more profitable for the railroad to sell it to landowners than to turn it into something else or to give it to the county.
There's a stretch behind Camp Joy that's pretty intact.
Yeah, there's a really long driveway that was the whole right-of-way at Camp Joy. Although it's privately owned and gated, unfortunately. So this is pretty much the earliest photo we have of a train, really the only photo we have of the train line to Boulder Creek from Felton. So it's taken from behind the church, which now is just all trees. You couldn't even get this shot today. And you can see they have even marked an SP, Southern Pacific Train, going down the Felton and Pescadero route.
So the river is in between.
The river's between. The river's kind of like right beneath the SP logo, or sign. So this curve, which is still there today, this curve is just near Brackney. So when you're driving and you have those two bridges, car bridges, and there's that little community to the right, that's Brackney. This was the only place on the whole line that we know of where people died during construction. The line was built with Chinese workers, and at least 2, possibly 3 died in this section because of slides. It's sand hills, and you can notice there's a slide in this picture. You've got this little push car gang here posing for the picture, but there's a slide that just happened recently when this picture was taken. So this was always a dangerous stretch. Most of the rest of the route didn't have very many obstacles, but this one section did. And even today, there is a landslide there, and you have to climb over it if you actually access that.
What is Brackney?
To get to Brackney, you go just south of the high school. There's 2 bridges over the San Lorenzo River.
Oh, that was
It's a little section between that is Brackney, and there's a Brackney road.
San Lorenzo Way.
San Lorenzo Way?
There's one of them, I think.
No, San Lorenzo Way is earlier.
Further
It's past there. Yeah, it's further.
Okay, this is past.
Yeah. And so this here is the town of Pacific Mills. You may know it as Ben Lomond. This was a nice idea. They were making a subdivision here called Sunnyside. And I believe actually a number of those road names still survive, so it's possible that parts of the subdivision really did come into existence. But what's interesting is this is the only real map that we have when Pacific Mills was still a thing. And you can see it. Look at all these tracks. This is the main line here. So this is coming from Felton. Felton's to the south here. And it goes through there, and this is kind of like, this is where the lumber store is, this is where the gas station is, and it goes on that way, and that's the Boulder Creek. But you can see all these other spurs. You got one going down here, you got one going down what would become Highway 9. You have one going up there towards Hubbard Gulch, and you have one that goes a little ways up Love Creek Road, although it actually went quite a ways up Love Creek Road. They just showed a little bit there, probably for marketing purposes. But so you can really see you have what became the modern town of Ben Lomond, and then you have the Mill Street. You have Mill Street with the actual mill, and those did kind of develop separately, and the railroad was kind of a weird division where you had the houses here and the main downtown developed here, and this was just railroad land. And so it was only after the railroad left in 1934 that Ben Lomond developed that stretch, and they did it really fast. There's photos from the late 30s that show all of a sudden downtown exists like we know it today. All right, and further down, there's not a ton of Felton and Pescadero era photos, unfortunately, of the route itself, except in Boulder Creek. This is one of the few ones that shows one of the South Pacific Coast trains going, I'm not even sure which direction, it could be going north or south, but this is probably just outside of Boulder Creek, just south of there, after crossing the San Lorenzo River. And you can see, not many trees, there's a couple, but there's not tons of trees in the background. It looks like there may even be an agricultural patch of some sort over there. And you got a stump right here. So this is the first stop in Boulder Creek. It was possibly, Lisa and I disagree with this, but it was either at Lorenzo or at the future site of Boulder, the Boulder Creek Station, which is behind, what's the building in Boulder Creek that's behind the station?
Firehouse.
The firehouse, yeah, thank you. So it was behind the firehouse. So this may not be behind the firehouse. This could be someplace else along the route while they were still working on the yard. But it's in that vicinity still. And you can notice they have one of their passenger cars. That's one of the Felton and Pescadero, Santa Cruz and Felton passenger cars. It's probably the one without the windows. And it's sadly been turned into a little station there. That was very common when they had these little rural stops. They'd turn them into little stations like that. And so this is, unfortunately, this is not a super detailed map. It looks detailed, but they were focusing on the parcels, not the railroad route. But you can see, so this is the last crossing of the San Lorenzo River. This is actually oriented properly, so north's up there. And we'll go, and this is Highway 9 here. And so this went on the back road, kind of. It hugged the river pretty closely until it made it up here, and this is where Railroad Avenue and all the street, the lower area near the creek park. I'm blanking on the name. The park is a depot. Junction Park. Thank you. So Junction Park was right here, or I mean, it is right here. And so this is that whole flats behind the firehouse.
Okay, 236 would be where now?
At 236, I think that would go kind of right through the middle of that.
It goes out in there somewhere, okay.
Yeah. And so there's a number of structures here. I'll show you pictures of those in a minute, but we've got spurs going up here. We've got spurs here. We're not going to talk about that quite yet. The flume originally would come straight north down to just about here. And then we have the second Boulder Creek station. This one was there for 20 plus years. You got the train parked outside. It's a pretty small station, tall though, but it's a pretty narrow station, and that's the freight loading door right there. This one was photographed pretty heavily, so you got another one. It's really short and squat, but really tall. These are all just different photos of the yard in the 1890s mostly. And so you have this big water tower. They had a smaller one, so I'm not quite sure what year this specific photo. Actually, no, I do. This one's 1893. The other one, I don't know when they got rid of the smaller tower. But you'll see the station house here. I got another picture of it here. I've got another picture of it here. I've got lots of pictures of this one. This thing could actually support 2 full switch engines. And the yard was big enough to actually need 2 engines, 2 locomotives to run all the cars around the yard. And that's mostly because of the logging railroad that I will talk about in a second. But this was a very busy spot. It was all lumber. There was no other industry of note in Boulder Creek. It was 100% lumber. And so you have the big switching yard. This is a gallows-style turntable you can see behind it. They would manually turn that thing to turn the engines around when necessary, or to turn any cars around. I'm going back. See? And yeah, you can just see the number of sidings and the piles and piles of lumber that you have here. This is all kind of behind the buildings that are on Central Avenue today. This is just piles of lumber.
And the little building that's past the tower is the one you just showed.
This is
the other picture.
Yeah, that's that building.
Yeah.
All right, and there's another one you can see. This is their biggest locomotive coming off the turntable. This was not stationed there. It just ran a lot of the runs down the Boulder Creek. By this point, it's basically the Boulder Creek branch. And you can see these are the Victorian houses that are behind the firehouse. I believe it. Do any of these survive? Yeah. Yeah, so a number of these still survive. You can see the schoolhouse up on the hill there. This is before the high school was built, correct? High school? Yeah, this is that's the only schoolhouse at the time. And you can see it, South Pacific Coast, but it's got the Sunset Route, which tells you clearly this is Southern Pacific era, because South Pacific Coast never had a Sunset Route. Sunset Route goes all the way to New Orleans, so it doesn't make sense for them to have that. And you can see another aerial shot here of this whole yard. This is a huge yard. I mean, downtown's there. This hotel still exists over there, and you can just see it's stretching all out.
The Dougherty building, is that still there? That's
The Dougherty building? I don't believe the Dougherty building's still there. It should be in this picture. It should be, let's see, where's the actual station? The station's here. It should be this one here. Yeah.
What direction are you in?
Sorry?
What direction is this?
So this is looking north. North would be up the valley here, so south is to the left. North is kind of that way.
No, it's that way. You're looking east. You're looking
Oh.
west.
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, sorry. North is right. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's south.
Yeah, so that's Boulder Creek. Yeah, that's Boulder Creek there. All right, and then this is a really just beautiful, fanciful photo. It's nighttime. There's 3 different locomotives parked here. And while this specific event may never have happened in a rainy, stormy night like this, it still is beautiful just to think about, like, this is what was going on in Boulder Creek around the turn of the century. So, getting back to the Flume was not ripped up immediately. For a long time, it seemed that one would replace the other. While they built the Felton and Pescadero route up to Boulder Creek, they would have gotten rid of the Flume. But they actually seem to have coexisted for at least a short while, probably a year, maybe even less. By the end of 1885, it seems most of the Flume was gone to Boulder Creek. But you can still see, there's a Flume cutting right through the middle of the Boulder Creek yard. There's this depot, there's a bunch of tracks on both sides of it, and there's the Flume going over to the other side of Boulder Creek.
But it's much lower.
It's much lower because it's near it's closer to headwaters. So it wasn't as high at this point. So this at this time is the terminus. And I don't actually have the photo here, but there is actually a photo of the end of the Flume in Boulder Creek during this time. But we still have the inefficiency problem. Most of the mills are north of Boulder Creek. So it's cool that we have a railroad to Boulder Creek. We still do not have efficiency. You still have, now you can take your oxen down to Boulder Creek and unload it onto the train, but you want to actually get it directly to market. You don't want to have to be doing all these switches. So our last solution. We're going to get rid of the Flume. But it wasn't an official railroad that did this project. 1 second. So it took a lumber company to actually decide to do this. The Santa Clara Valley Mill and Lumber Company, it had been operating within the Santa Cruz Mountains for 15, 20 years by this point. It was very well established. In fact, a lot of the reason why Los Gatos Creek area is harvested before this time was because they were operating in that valley. And so they had just lost their mill that was on Zayene Creek, and they were looking to relocate. They owned a bunch of land up north of Boulder Creek, about 4 miles. They're like, let's turn this into a new railroad, or into a new mill. Easiest way to do that, bring a railroad. They had already done that in Zayene. Zayene Road is actually a railroad right-of-way for a good 3 miles of it. I mean, the road itself is the right-of-way. And so you wouldn't know it because it was a steep, rugged, it had switchbacks to get up to the grade. But so they used to go up there, and then the mill burned down in 1887, and they said, okay, let's go to Boulder Creek. So spring 1888, they started building a railroad past Boulder Creek. Well, by this point, the Flume really is worthless, so they finally start demolishing it. So by the end of 1888, it seems most of the Flume's gone. There may have been some feeder creeks.
They actually blew it up.
So there you go. Well, there you go. They blew it up on the section north of Boulder Creek. Yeah. So they blew it up. Now, some of the feeder creek flumes, because all the feeder creeks also had flumes, those may have survived longer. There's at least some scarce evidence that says that some pieces of flume still survived, but it was done as an actual thing that could work. And so by 1889, nothing's left, but the railroad is now going 4 miles, possibly more by this already, 4 miles up past the Wildwood area that I mentioned earlier to a place that was called Dougherty's. And Dougherty is named after the owners of the Santa Clara Valley Mill and Lumber Company, and you'll often see the name in local stuff saying Dougherty's, and that's what it's a reference to. And so they built a really nice mill, burned down at least twice, at a site which is called Riverside Grove, I believe is the current subdivision that was on. So that's 4 miles north, but that still is only getting you to the mill, and that's really useful, but what mill companies really like to do, and they did all over Santa Cruz County, is they like to bring the logs, these big logs, down to the mill. And it's also easy to do that with a railroad, because imagine having to drag with the oxen on these, basically they're dragging them on top of oiled logs, these big redwood trees. And they've been dragging these things all the way down to the mill. That's really hard to do. And it takes a ton of energy, and you have to have these oxen teams that are specially trained, stick it on a railroad car. So it kept going. It went another 4 miles for a total of 8 miles up to basically the headwaters of San Lorenzo River, just beneath Castle Rock State Park's, or Castle Rock itself, the waterfall rock, just down there basically is where the railroad ended, where it kind of gets flat.
Over here.
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah.
How much in diameter of a log did they fit on the Flume?
On the Flumes, they didn't do logs on the Flume. It was only actual finished boards. So the boards were usually 1 foot by 1 inch thick and variable length. But yeah, that would be, it was just board feet of actual lumber. They couldn't do logs on it. It just doesn't work. I assume the knots would cause lots of problems. So the final terminus was at 2 miles north of Waterman Switch. Now again, if you go up to the Saratoga Toll Road, where there's a little parking spot and there's a little kiosk up there north of Boulder Creek, you can actually find the old right-of-way. That spot, that parking lot, is Waterman Switch. And that is important to know, although not as much for this talk, but Waterman Switch is it's kind of the maximum extent that the railroad remained viable. Past there, they got really cheap. They just start, like every time they needed to do a crossing over a river, they just fell a tree and stick some ties on it. So the viable part of the railroad only went up to Cunningham Mill. Up to Cunningham Mill, I think I've got a picture of it, actually. Yeah, here we go. This is the trestle that goes right to Wildwood. And this one was in place until about 1918. And this trestle marked the end of where the railroad was pretty much a legal railroad in the sense of passengers could actually go on it without the railroad potentially getting in trouble. So anything north of here, and this is just 2 miles north of Boulder Creek, anything north of here, most of the trestles are logs. Most of the things are done really kind of badly, and the train would probably be wobbling a bit. Derailments were super common. So the Cunningham Mill, which is the site of the old Flume Mill, it all comes back together. That was really the end of where the railroad functionally ended, and past that it was just really low quality construction. And just to give you an idea, so here's Boulder Creek, again looking north. So yeah, here's Bear Creek, Boulder Creek, and these are all the different mills that operated off of it until 1900. There were more mills, but these are the ones that are important for this talk. Harmon Mill obviously is way up here, and there's no railroad that went up here, but they did have a spur just down there. And then the Maccabee Mill, they had a spur that went there, and they may have actually had the track go further up. Kings Creek did not have a track, so ignore that. Cunningham Mill, which I've been mentioning, is right here. So this is the modern site of Wildwood. Dougherty's Mill, that's where they built the route to begin with. And then they just kept going. And there was a spur that went up to Chase Mill, which is on Feeder Creek. And you can actually still find ties and rails up in that. And then Waterman Switch is where where Highway 9 cuts up the hill and finally leaves the San Lorenzo Valley, basically. That's Waterman Switch, and the Saratoga Toll Road kept going straight for a couple more miles.
The most northern part of 236 and Highway 9, that driveway across, and you go down, there's an old mill down there. What mill is that?
That's I'll get to that later, in the other talk, but that is the Waterman Gap Mill. That is a later mill that is on the site, I should say, of the Waterman Gap Mill. And yeah, that was the original mill there was built around 1903, 1904.
So floor is still there, and it's rough hewn redwood. Yeah. Literally 4 feet thick.
Yeah.
40 feet long.
That area there, I still need to explore it, but I've been shown a number of pictures of it. But yeah, that is kind of the end of the story for that line, is because they shipped the stuff down from that mill to Waterman Switch to get it to market. Yeah.
Quick question. I heard a couple of trains were lost in mudslides. And was one of them near the Harmon Mill near Clear Creek?
I am of the belief that most train stories of lost trains are unfortunately myths. While it is possible, they were very expensive to build and not as difficult as most people think now that it is to get them back on the track. Yes, they often need cleaning, but from what I understand, no actual train got lost in the Santa Cruz Mountains, despite stories and persistent myths that suggest they are. I have heard of one of the stories, there was a number of really bad wrecks up there, but only one train operated, it's this one here actually, only one train operated on the Dougherty line, and it's this one right here, and this one survived all the way to the end. So if one did get lost up there, I don't know which one it would be.
How about up the Zayani area there?
Yeah, Zayani is the one that's probably the most persistent rumor, and the thing is, I have never actually seen a primary source anywhere that mentions it's lost to begin with, so I really don't know. I've only seen that from other people writing about it, so unfortunately I can't say.
Dougherty's mill up there, Zayani, is that was a pretty good sized mill too.
It was, yeah.
Kind of abandoned it or burnt down?
It burned down. It burned down in late 1886 it burned down. And they kind of kept it running on a shoestring budget for next year, but gave up more or less by 1887. And so that's why they moved.
There's still a piece of rail if you ever would, if you could.
Yeah, I know. I've actually seen it up there. This is the Felton. This is the railroad. You remember the Felton? It was the one that was on one of the sides of the Felton Flume. So the Dougherty line bought it. They repurposed it for their line, and they renamed it the Dinky because it was a small little train. And just for perspective, so this is one of the larger South Pacific Coast engines, but they're both narrow gauge engines, and you can just see the comparison of size there. So that's why we call it the Dinky. The Santa Cruz would have been the same exact size. This was actually the teeniest bit more upgraded because it came a year later. I already showed you that one. So the main mill up there was the Dougherty Mill, also known as Santa Clara Valley Mill and Lumber Company Mill. And the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History has a number of photos of it. And you can see, these are trestles over the San Lorenzo River. They are built on logs. And you can see here, very clearly, it's built on logs. And so this is from the south looking north. This is from the north looking south at the same thing. The buildings are the same. the one in the distance is the same building. And a lot of people posing. There's another one here. This is just a teeny bit further north. Where they were posing is just up there. And you can see this track here actually goes to, they had an engine house. They have an engine, so they need a place to store it in the off season. So they actually have a little engine house up here that goes around the river, because this popped onto a little jetty of the east bank, and it went back onto the west bank of the San Lorenzo River. So the mill's on the east bank, but the track also looped around without having to cross over there. So it went through and around. And here's another fanciful picture of the dinghy, looking all nice, with the lumber crew posing beside it. So just in conclusion, what we have here is we have 7.3 miles of the Boulder Creek branch. It's going up from Felton, from across the river, all the way up to Boulder Creek. We have 8.5 roughly miles of the Dougherty extension. And we also have a 3.5 mile track that was built to Newell Creek around 1902. And that got extended. It was standard gauged eventually, but the extension was always narrow gauge. We have 9 registered stations. These are places that people could actually get off or on to the train. And they're also places where the lumber would be transferred and stuff. And that's just on the first part, on that 7.3 mile part. It also had 6 crossings over the San Lorenzo River. All of this was narrow gauge. And by the time that the earthquake happened in 1906, everything was falling apart.